The rain hammered against the car window like a relentless whisper from the past. Cassian Dorne sat in the back seat of his sleek black sedan, staring out into the wet streets of Vermillion City. Drops streaked down the tinted glass, distorting the world outside into a blur of neon lights and moving shadows. He let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the leather seat, his mind tangled with thoughts of mergers and acquisitions. Power, control, influence. These were the only things that mattered. Or so he told himself. The car slowed to a stop at a red light, and in that brief moment of stillness, something caught his attention. A boy stood on the sidewalk, drenched from head to toe, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes locked onto Cassian with unsettling intensity. He couldn't have been more than 10, wearing an oversized jacket that sagged from his small frame, his lips trembling from the cold. Cassian's driver, a stoic man named Avery, glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Should I move, sir?" But Cassian didn't answer. Instead, he rolled down the window just enough to hear past the drumming rain. The boy stepped forward without hesitation, his shoes splashing in the puddles beneath him. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, rusted key, extending it toward Cassian with a trembling hand. "Mom says it belongs to you," the boy said, his voice small yet unwavering. Cassian stared at the key, his pulse quickening in his chest. It was old, tarnished, and worn from years of handling, yet the intricate engravings along its surface were unmistakably familiar. His breath hitched, and for a fleeting second, it felt as though time had pulled him backward, dragging him into the forgotten corridors of his past. He could almost hear the echo of laughter, the distant hum of an old melody, the smell of worn-out books and candle wax. "Who's your mother?" Cassian asked, his voice sharper than intended. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he pressed the key into Cassian's palm, his cold fingers lingering for a second before he turned and ran, disappearing into the rain without another word. "Hey!" Cassian shouted after him, pushing the car door open, but the boy was already gone, swallowed by the crowded city streets. He stared after him, rain seeping into his clothes, his fingers gripping the key tightly. Avery cleared his throat. "Shall I proceed, sir?" Cassian exhaled sharply and slid back into the car, shutting the door with a force that betrayed his unease. He studied the key in his palm, its cold weight settling like a stone in his chest. For years, he had buried every remnant of his past beneath layers of success and control. Yet here it was, resurfacing in the most unexpected of ways. "Take me home," he muttered, his voice devoid of its usual authority. The city lights blurred past as the car moved through the streets, but Cassian's mind remained fixed on the key. His thumb traced the engravings absently, and memories stirred in the corners of his mind. The last time he had seen this key, it had been in his father's hands. His father, whose legacy he had fought so hard to escape. Back at his penthouse, Cassian stood in front of the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain wash over the city below. The skyline stretched endlessly, a testament to his relentless ambition. Yet tonight, it felt hollow. He turned the key over in his hands, feeling its jagged edges bite into his skin. A distant voice echoed in his memory, his father's deep and unwavering tone. "Some keys open more than just doors, Cassian." He shook his head, pushing the thought away. His father had always been a man of riddles and half-truths, a man who valued mystery over answers. Cassian had spent years tearing down the walls his father had built, carving his own empire from the rubble. And yet, here he was, holding on to a piece of that old world as if it still had power over him. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, the name Lyra Dorne flashing on the screen. His sister, another piece of the past he preferred to ignore. He let the call go to voicemail, rubbing his temple. Cassian walked to his desk, opening his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he typed in a name he hadn't searched in years. Seraphine Arden. The moment the letters appeared on the screen, his chest tightened. The search results loaded, and there it was, an address tucked away in a part of the city he had long since forgotten. A place where ghosts of the past lingered, waiting. He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the key once more. The rain outside continued to fall, steady and unrelenting, as if urging him forward into a storm he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Cassian stood outside the worn-down apartment building, the hum of the city a distant murmur behind him. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the streets slick and shimmering under the flickering glow of a nearby street lamp. He hesitated, the key resting heavily in his pocket, its weight pressing against the past he had so carefully locked away. The building before him was nothing like the grand halls of his past life, crumbling brickwork, graffiti scrawled across the entrance, and windows dimly lit with the weary glow of struggling lives. He took a deep breath and stepped inside. The scent of damp wood and stale air greeted him, stirring a sense of nostalgia he wasn't prepared for. His footsteps echoed in the narrow hallway as he passed by doors with peeling paint and faded numbers. Apartment 3B, Seraphine's name was still on the mailbox, written in faded ink. His fingers brushed over it, lingering for a moment before he knocked. For a long time, there was no response. Cassian considered turning away, pushing the key deeper into his pocket and leaving it all behind. But just as he took a step back, the door creaked open a few inches, and there she was, Seraphine Arden. She looked different, older, worn down by time in a way that tugged at something deep inside him. Her once bright emerald eyes now held a guarded weariness, and strands of gray wove through her dark hair. She stared at him for a long moment, her lips pressed into a thin line before she spoke. "You shouldn't be here, Cassian," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of old wounds. Cassian forced a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't exactly plan it. Your son found me." Her expression hardened. "Elian?" He nodded, pulling the key from his pocket and holding it up between them. "He said you told him this belongs to me. Care to explain?" Seraphine's eyes flickered to the key, and for a fleeting moment, something like sadness crossed her face. She opened the door wider and stepped aside without another word. Cassian walked in, taking in the cramped but tidy apartment. The scent of coffee and lavender filled the air, and photographs lined the walls. Pictures of Elian at different ages, each one a painful reminder of how much time had passed. Seraphine folded her arms and leaned against the kitchen counter, studying him. "Why did you come, Cassian?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Because your kid showed up out of nowhere in the rain and handed me this key. And because—" He hesitated, glancing around the room. "I never expected to see your name again. Not after all these years." Her lips curled into a bitter smile. "Life has a funny way of catching up with us, doesn't it?" Cassian looked at her closely, searching for the girl he once knew beneath the tired lines on her face. "Why now, Seraphine?" "After everything, why send him to me?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the mugs in her hand. "I didn't send him. He found some old letters of mine, ones I never meant for him to see. He got it into his head that you needed to know." "Know what?" Seraphine exhaled slowly and gestured toward the couch. "Sit down, Cassian. There's something I should have told you a long time ago." He sat stiffly, waiting. The sound of the rain tapping against the window filled the silence between them. Seraphine looked down at her hands, as if gathering the right words. "Your father, Alistair. He had secrets, Cassian. Secrets that he never wanted you to find out. And that key," she nodded toward it, is the last piece of something much bigger than either of us realized. Cassian's grip on the key tightened. My father's been dead for over a decade. Whatever he was hiding died with him. Not everything, Seraphine said softly. That key, it's to the old Dorne estate, the one you walked away from, and inside. There are things you should have seen before you decided to leave it all behind. Cassian swallowed hard. The Dorne estate, a place filled with ghosts, regret, and memories he'd spent years outrunning. He thought he'd burned every bridge leading back to it, yet here he was, standing on the edge of it all again. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, his voice quieter. Seraphine's eyes met his, and for the first time he saw fear in them. "Because someone else is looking for it too, and they're not asking nicely." Cassian stiffened. "Who?" Seraphine shook her head. "I don't know exactly, but I've been getting calls. Strange people asking about your father's estate, about the key. I never told Elian, but I think he felt something was wrong. That's why he went looking for you." Cassian leaned back, his mind racing. Someone was after his father's secrets, and somehow, after all these years, they had led back to him. He looked down at the key in his palm, feeling its weight differently now. Seraphine stood, walking toward the door. "You should go," she said softly, "and whatever you do, be careful, Cassian. This isn't just about the past anymore." He nodded slowly, slipping the key back into his pocket. As he stepped out into the rain once more, he couldn't shake the feeling that the ghosts of his past were no longer content to stay buried. And for the first time in a long time, Cassian felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of unfinished business. Cassian stood outside Seraphine's apartment building, the rain whispering around him in soft, persistent drizzles. His thoughts churned as he gripped the key in his pocket, its edges pressing into his palm like a cruel reminder of everything he had buried. He glanced back at the dimly lit window where Seraphine had been watching him moments ago. Her face, lined with worry and secrets, lingered in his mind. He hailed a cab and gave the driver an address he hadn't spoken aloud in years. The Dorne estate. The words tasted foreign in his mouth, thick with memory and regret. As the city lights faded into the distance, Cassian gazed out of the window, his mind drifting back to the last time he had stood at those towering iron gates. He had walked away without a second thought, leaving behind a home steeped in his father's suffocating expectations and whispers of betrayal that had fractured their family beyond repair. When the cab pulled up to the estate's entrance, Cassian hesitated before stepping out. The wrought iron gate stood before him, rusted and overgrown with ivy, as if nature itself had been trying to swallow the place whole. He pushed the gate open, the creak echoing through the silence. The old gravel driveway stretched before him, leading to the grand yet decaying mansion that loomed in the darkness like a forgotten relic of his family's once proud legacy. The air smelled of damp earth and old wood, and Cassian felt an involuntary shiver run down his spine as he approached the front doors. He ran his fingers over the brass handle, hesitating. He could almost hear his father's voice, stern and disapproving, warning him about prying into things better left alone. Shaking the thought away, he pulled out the key and slid it into the lock. The door groaned open, revealing a dark foyer cloaked in dust and silence. Cassian stepped inside cautiously, the wooden floors creaking beneath his weight. The air was thick with the scent of aged leather and mildew, and in the faint moonlight filtering through the stained glass windows, he could see the grand staircase winding upward like a path to the ghosts of his past. He made his way through the main hall, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Familiar objects stood frozen in time, his mother's piano covered in a thick sheet of dust, the grand chandelier looming overhead, and the portraits of his ancestors staring down at him with hollow eyes. He reached the study, the one place his father had always kept locked, and paused. Taking a deep breath, Cassian turned the key in the heavy oak door. It clicked open, revealing the room exactly as he remembered it. Dark mahogany shelves lined with books, a large oak desk in the center, and the faint scent of tobacco lingering in the air. He stepped inside, running his fingers along the desk's surface, his eyes drawn to the stack of old ledgers and papers that sat untouched. Something glinted in the dim light. A small, ornate box sat on the shelf behind the desk, its gold filigree catching his eye. Cassian reached for it, his heart pounding. He opened it slowly, revealing a collection of letters tied together with a red silk ribbon. The handwriting was unmistakable, his father's. Cassian sank into the leather chair and untied the ribbon, unfolding the first letter with trembling hands. The words leapt off the page, striking him like a blow to the chest. To my son, Cassian, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here to keep the past where it belongs. The truth I once sought to protect must now find its way to you. There is more to our family's legacy than you have been told. Be careful who you trust. His pulse quickened as he flipped through the letters, each one peeling back another layer of deception and intrigue. Mentions of hidden properties, sealed documents, and names he didn't recognize filled the pages. One name, however, stood out: Victor Drake. Cassian's eyes narrowed. Victor Drake was a name he knew well, a ruthless businessman with a reputation as cold as steel. But what connection did his father have with him? He rummaged through the desk drawers, his hands shaking slightly, until he found an envelope addressed to Seraphine. His breath caught. It was unopened. The rain outside picked up, tapping against the window like a steady drumbeat as Cassian sat there, the weight of the discoveries pressing down on him. What had his father been involved in? And why had Seraphine kept all of this from him? A sudden noise made him freeze. Footsteps. Cassian stiffened, every muscle tensing as he listened. The sound was faint but deliberate. Someone else was in the house. He closed the box and tucked it under his arm, his heartbeat roaring in his ears. As he crept toward the study door, a shadow moved across the hallway, and for a split second he saw the glint of something metallic, perhaps a gun. His instincts kicked in. He moved silently, slipping through a side passage he knew well, his mind racing. Whoever was in the house wasn't just looking for memories. They were after something else. Something that, if his father's letters were right, could be far more dangerous than Cassian had anticipated. As he emerged into the rain-soaked night, Cassian's grip on the key tightened. He needed answers, and if Seraphine wasn't willing to give them, he would have to find them himself. Cassian's heart pounded as he walked briskly down the estate's long, overgrown driveway, the box of letters clutched tightly under his arm. The rain had picked up again, falling in heavy sheets, soaking through his expensive jacket and plastering his dark hair to his forehead. He didn't care. His mind was racing too fast to notice the cold. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure from inside the house following him, but the darkness remained still. Whoever they were, they had come prepared. That metallic glint, the quiet footsteps, this wasn't just some petty thief poking around for old valuables. No, this was someone who knew what they were looking for. Someone who, just like him, was after the truth buried within the walls of the Dorne estate. Reaching the front gate, Cassian slipped through, his grip on the old box tightening as if it might disappear. He hailed another cab and slid into the back seat, his breath coming in short bursts. The driver shot him a wary glance in the rearview mirror, but said nothing as Cassian barked out his destination, back to his penthouse. The ride felt longer this time. The city lights stretched endlessly outside the window, and Cassian couldn't shake the unease creeping under his skin. He pulled out one of the letters and read it under the dim light of the passing street lamps. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Cassian, I know you think your success was built on your own ambition, but the truth is far more complicated. I did things I hoped you would never have to know about. But secrets don't stay buried forever. The key I gave you, it's not just to the house, it's to something bigger. The old bank in Hollowbrook, the safety deposit box under my name, holds answers that will change everything. If you're reading this, be careful. There are those who will do anything to keep the past from coming to light. Cassian let out a slow breath, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The Hollowbrook Bank. He hadn't thought of that place in years. His father had taken him there once when he was just a boy, warning him never to ask about it again. And now, after all these years, it seemed the answers he had been unknowingly searching for were hidden in that very place. As the cab pulled up to his building, Cassian quickly paid the driver and entered the lobby, nodding at the night concierge. The elevator ride felt suffocating, the walls closing in around him. When the doors slid open to his penthouse, he stepped inside and immediately locked the door behind him. Placing the box of letters on his desk, he exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his damp hair. He needed to think. He needed a plan. Pulling out his phone, he scrolled through his contacts before landing on the name he hadn't called in years, Orion Vale, his longtime friend and former business partner. If anyone could help him dig into the bank records and uncover the truth, it was Orion. After a brief hesitation, he hit dial. The call rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. Cassian, been a while. Too long, Cassian said, forcing his voice to remain steady. I need your help, no questions asked. A pause. That's not exactly how things work with me anymore, Cass. But I'm listening. Cassian glanced at the letters spread across the desk. My father left behind something at a bank in Hollowbrook. I need access to whatever he was hiding. Orion sighed on the other end. Hollowbrook? Cassian, that place is trouble. It's off the grid for a reason. If Alistair Dorne had dealings there, they weren't legal. Cassian clenched his jaw. I don't care. Can you get me in? Another pause, longer this time. Meet me tomorrow, noon, my office. The line went dead. Cassian tossed the phone onto the desk and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His father's voice echoed in his mind once again, warning him of locked doors and buried secrets. He thought he had outgrown them, left them behind with the dusty remnants of his childhood. But now it seemed those ghosts were clawing their way back to the surface. He stood abruptly, pacing the room. His father had always been a man of power and influence, but Cassian had spent years building his empire on his own terms. He had sworn he would never become his father. Yet here he was, following the breadcrumbs of his legacy, unraveling a mystery that felt far too dangerous to ignore. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. His muscles tensed. It was nearly midnight. No one ever visited him at this hour. He approached cautiously, his hand reaching for the heavy brass handle. Peering through the peephole, he saw Seraphine standing there, her dark eyes filled with urgency. Cassian opened the door, and before he could speak, she stepped inside and closed it behind her. You shouldn't have gone to the house, she whispered, her voice trembling. Cassian frowned. Someone else was there, he said, studying her face. What's going on, Seraphine? She bit her lip, her hands wringing together. They know, Cassian. They know you have the key, and they won't stop until they get it. Cassian's stomach tightened. Who are they? Seraphine glanced around the room as if expecting someone to be listening. Men connected to Victor Drake. Your father made deals with them? Dangerous deals? And now that you're looking into it, you've made yourself a target. Cassian's jaw tightened. So, what am I supposed to do? Pretend none of this is happening? Seraphine shook her head. You have to be smart about this. The bank isn't safe anymore. If you go there, they'll be watching. You need a different way." Cassian studied her carefully. "And what do you suggest?" She hesitated before reaching into her coat pocket and pulling out a slip of paper. "There's someone who can help you. An old friend of your father's. He goes by the name Jonas Quinn. He might know what's inside that deposit box, and more importantly, how to get to it safely." Cassian took the paper, his eyes scanning the name. The weight of the situation pressed against his chest like an iron chain. He had stepped into something far bigger than he anticipated, and now there was no turning back. Seraphine placed a hand on his arm. "Be careful, Cassian. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." Cassian nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. The door had been opened, and there was no choice but to walk through it. Cassian sat in his dimly lit penthouse, the slip of paper Seraphine had given him resting on the desk before him. The name Jonas Quinn stared back at him in bold, hurried strokes. It meant nothing to him, yet the weight it carried in Seraphine's voice suggested otherwise. He drummed his fingers against the polished wood surface, his thoughts racing. Every instinct told him to walk away, to bury this mystery just like he had buried his past. But he couldn't. Not now. The city outside stretched endlessly, neon lights flickering in the distance, but Cassian felt suffocated. He picked up his phone and dialed the number scribbled on the paper. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Quinn?" Cassian hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "Seraphine sent me." A pause. "Dorne?" The voice sounded wary, and Cassian could almost hear the gears turning on the other end. "Meet me at the Hollow Tavern, 20 minutes. Alone." The line went dead before Cassian could respond. He stared at the phone, his jaw tightening. Hollow Tavern. The name triggered a faint recollection, an old bar nestled in the city's underbelly, a place where deals were struck in whispers and shadows. He knew he was walking deeper into dangerous territory, but the alternative, doing nothing, wasn't an option. Cassian grabbed his coat and slipped out into the night. The streets were slick with rain, the rhythmic pattering matching the unease thrumming through his veins. The Hollow Tavern was tucked away in an alley off Hollowbrook Avenue, a place where the light never quite reached, and the air smelled of stale beer and forgotten dreams. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with cigarette smoke and low murmurs. Cassian scanned the room, his sharp gaze landing on a man seated in the corner booth. Jonas Quinn. The man was older than Cassian expected, with graying hair slicked back and sharp eyes that seemed to cut through the haze. A scar ran down his jawline, a souvenir from a life Cassian didn't dare to guess. "You don't look much like your old man," Quinn said, eyeing him up and down as Cassian slid into the seat across from him. Cassian leaned back, studying the man with equal scrutiny. "That's intentional." Quinn smirked, lighting a cigarette with steady hands. "Seraphine said you might come looking for answers. Funny thing about answers, son, they tend to come with more questions." Cassian placed the key on the table between them. "What does this open?" Quinn's eyes darkened as he exhaled a long plume of smoke. He picked up the key, turning it over between his fingers like he was handling a relic. "Haven't seen one of these in a long time," he muttered. "Your father was a cautious man. He trusted very few." Cassian's patience wore thin. "What's inside the deposit box?" Quinn tapped the ash from his cigarette, his expression unreadable. "Information, the kind that people like Victor Drake would kill to keep buried." He leaned in, his voice lowering. "Your father had dealings that stretched deeper than you realize. Offshore accounts, shell companies, leverage over powerful people. But there was one thing he kept hidden, something that could ruin Drake." Cassian clenched his fists under the table. "What is it?" Quinn gave a dry chuckle. "That's the thing, kid. I don't know. But I do know it's dangerous enough that your father made sure no one could access it without that key." He nodded toward the object resting between them. "And now that you have it, you've made yourself a target." Cassian's mind raced. His father's empire had always been built on power plays and manipulation, but he had no idea the depth of it. "How do I get into the bank without Drake's people catching on?" Quinn leaned back, flicking his cigarette into an ashtray. "You're asking the wrong question, Dorne. The real question is, do you have the guts to see this through?" Cassian met his gaze, the weight of the moment settling over him like a heavy cloak. "I don't have a choice." Quinn nodded approvingly. "Smart answer. There's an old service entrance to the bank, one your father used when he didn't want to be seen. I can get you in, but once you're inside, you're on your own. If Drake's men are watching, they'll be waiting." Cassian exhaled sharply, the gravity of the situation pressing down on him. He had built his entire life on calculated risks, but this was different. This was personal. Quinn scribbled an address on a napkin and slid it across the table. "Tomorrow night, midnight, be there, and don't bring any of your fancy security, just you and the key." Cassian took the napkin and slipped it into his pocket. He stood, nodding once. "I'll be there." As he walked out of the bar and back into the rain-soaked streets, Cassian felt the cold seep into his bones. The key in his pocket felt heavier than ever. He was no longer just chasing ghosts of his past. He was standing at the edge of something far more dangerous, something that had the power to shatter everything he had built. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. The next day crept by at an agonizing pace, each hour stretching longer than the last. Cassian spent most of it in his penthouse, pacing the sleek floors, his mind a relentless cycle of questions and uncertainties. The key felt like a burning weight in his pocket, a tangible reminder of everything he thought he had left behind. Outside, the city carried on as usual, honking cars, flashing billboards, people moving without a clue that somewhere beneath them, secrets were waiting to be unearthed. As midnight approached, Cassian dressed in dark, unassuming clothes, pulling on a heavy coat to shield himself from the biting cold. He stood in front of his bathroom mirror for a long moment, staring at the reflection of a man he barely recognized. His jaw was set, his eyes dark with purpose. He had spent years perfecting the image of the untouchable billionaire, the one who always had the upper hand. But now he felt like the boy he once was. Curious, reckless, and dangerously close to falling into something far bigger than himself. Shaking off the thought, he slipped the key into his pocket and left. The city had quieted by the time he reached Hollowbrook Bank, the streets deserted save for the occasional car rolling by, headlights slicing through the fog. The building loomed in front of him, a towering monolith of stone and iron, its imposing structure designed to keep secrets buried. Jonas Quinn was already there, leaning casually against the alley wall, his cigarette glowing in the darkness. He flicked it away when he saw Cassian approach. "Right on time," he muttered, giving Cassian a once-over. "You look nervous." Cassian didn't bother responding. "Let's get this over with." Quinn smirked but didn't press further. He led Cassian around the side of the building to a rusted metal door, barely visible beneath layers of grime and ivy. Quinn jiggled the handle and pulled out a set of tools from his coat. "Your old man was smart. This entrance was his little secret. Used it to come and go without anyone noticing." Cassian watched as Quinn worked on the lock, his movements swift and precise. The door groaned in protest before finally giving way, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor that smelled of mildew and neglect. "Stay close," Quinn said, stepping inside. The hallway stretched into darkness, the air thick with dust and the weight of long-forgotten secrets. Cassian's footsteps echoed softly as he followed, his senses on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant hum of the building's aging electrical system made his nerves tighten. "This is it," Quinn whispered, stopping in front of a heavy steel door marked Restricted Access. "Your key should do the trick." Cassian hesitated for only a second before pulling the key from his pocket and sliding it into the lock. A deep click echoed through the hallway, and the door slowly creaked open. Inside was a small, sterile-looking room with a row of safety deposit boxes lining the walls, each one marked with a number. "Box 47, Quinn said, nodding toward the far corner. Cassian approached it cautiously, his pulse quickening. His fingers trembled slightly as he inserted the key and turned it. The latch gave way with a soft snap, and he pulled the heavy metal box free, placing it on the table in the center of the room. He lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged documents filled the space: old contracts, financial records, and a stack of faded photographs. Cassian sifted through them, his eyes scanning pages filled with names he barely recognized. But one thing was clear: his father had been entangled in a web far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Offshore accounts, wire transfers, shell corporations, all tied back to Victor Drake, the man Cassian had long considered an enemy but never suspected was this deeply involved with his father. Then, beneath the papers, he found something unexpected: a leather-bound journal, its edges worn and frayed with age. He opened it to the first page, and his breath caught. It was his father's handwriting. "Cassian, if you're reading this, I've failed to protect you from the truth. I built an empire not out of ambition, but out of survival. Drake was never just a competitor. He was a threat, and now he's yours to deal with. Everything you need to take him down is in these pages. But be warned, there are things even I wasn't willing to face." Cassian's hands tightened around the journal as he turned the pages, his father's words unfolding a story of deception, betrayal, and choices that had shaped everything Cassian had become. His father had been playing a dangerous game, and now it was his turn to finish it. Before he could read further, Quinn's voice cut through his thoughts. "We need to go. Now." Cassian looked up, startled by the urgency in Quinn's tone. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, growing louder with every second. Cassian shoved the documents and the journal back into the metal box and closed it, slipping it under his coat. Quinn motioned toward the back exit, and they moved swiftly, sticking to the shadows. Just as they reached the door, it burst open, and a figure stepped inside, blocking their path. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in all black, the man's eyes locked onto Cassian with a cold, predatory glare. "Going somewhere, Dorne?" Cassian's stomach clenched. Victor Drake's men had found him. Quinn didn't hesitate. He grabbed Cassian by the arm and pulled him down the side corridor, the sound of heavy footsteps following close behind. Cassian's heart pounded in his chest as they sprinted through the narrow passageway, ducking into a side exit that led into the rain-slicked alley. "Keep moving," Quinn hissed, leading him down the darkened streets. "They're not going to stop now." Cassian barely registered the cold rain soaking through his clothes. All he could think about was the journal burning in his hands, the secrets, the lies, and the undeniable truth that his father's past was now his responsibility. As they slipped into the night, Cassian knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Cassian and Quinn moved swiftly through the rain-soaked streets, their footsteps echoing against the deserted alleyways. The adrenaline in Cassian's veins had yet to fade, his pulse hammering in his ears. His mind raced through the implications of what he had found: the ledger, the journal, the undeniable proof that his father had been involved in dealings far beyond corporate ambition. They ducked into a side street, and Quinn pulled Cassian into a narrow doorway, pressing his back against the damp brick wall. He peered around the corner, his sharp eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. "We lost them," Quinn muttered, wiping rain from his face. For now. Cassian, breathing hard, leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. Drake's people won't stop. They know what I have now. Quinn let out a bitter chuckle. Of course they do. Your father was playing chess with men who don't take kindly to losing. You walk into their game and you either win or you don't walk out at all. Cassian opened his coat and pulled out the leather journal, holding it gingerly as if it might fall apart. He flipped to a random page, his father's handwriting leaping out at him in dark, hurried strokes. Drake was never satisfied with power. He needed control. The accounts were just the surface. Beneath them lies something far more dangerous. If he finds it before Cassian does, everything I've built will crumble. I only hope my son will be stronger than I was. Cassian frowned, scanning the pages rapidly. His father had laid out meticulous details, company acquisitions, offshore accounts, and hidden deals Drake had used to fund operations that stretched far beyond the corporate world. Weapons contracts, smuggling routes, government blackmail. His throat tightened. This isn't just about money, he murmured. Drake's been running an entire underground network, and my father knew about it. Quinn exhaled sharply. That's why they want you dead, Cassian. You've got the receipts, and if you expose Drake, a lot of powerful people are going down with him. Cassian clenched his jaw, his mind already working through the possibilities. Then I have to move fast. He turned to Quinn, his expression hard. You know how to get in touch with the right people? Quinn smirked. You planning on going public with this? Cassian shook his head. Not yet. I need leverage first. Quinn studied him for a long moment before nodding. I know a guy. Name's Kieran Blake. Ex-intelligence, knows how to make things disappear or reappear when needed. He pulled out his phone and tapped a few times before handing it over. Give him a call, but be careful. He doesn't work cheap. Cassian accepted the phone and stepped away, his fingers tapping nervously against the device. He dialed the number Quinn provided, listening to the steady ring before a gruff voice answered. Blake? Cassian Dorne. I need your help. There was a pause, followed by a low chuckle. Well, well, the prodigal son returns. What took you so long? I have something that could bring down Victor Drake, but I need protection, and I need it now. Blake's tone turned serious. Meet me at Pier 17, an hour, and don't bring your shadow. Cassian hung up, slipping the phone back to Quinn. Pier 17. He wants to meet alone. Quinn arched an eyebrow. Sketchy, but Blake's your best shot if you want to stay alive long enough to use what you've got? Cassian nodded and adjusted his coat. Then I'll go alone. An hour later, Cassian stood at the edge of Pier 17, the wind whipping through his soaked clothes. The docks stretched into the darkness, creaking under the weight of the rising tide. A lone figure emerged from the shadows, trench coat billowing in the wind. Blake. You don't waste time, Blake said, his eyes scanning Cassian with a practiced sharpness. Neither does Drake, Cassian replied, pulling out the journal and showing it to him. I need to know what my father was trying to protect, and I need to make sure this doesn't get me killed. Blake flipped through the pages quickly, his expression unreadable. Your old man was deep in this mess. If you're planning to go after Drake, you need more than a few pages of dirty secrets. Cassian crossed his arms. Then what do I need? Blake looked up, his gaze piercing. Proof that Drake is still pulling the strings. Something current, something undeniable. He paused, then added, and you need an exit plan, because once you go after a man like Victor Drake, there's no turning back. Cassian considered his words carefully. Do you have a way into Drake's operations? Blake smirked. I might, but it'll cost you. I'm not worried about money. Good, Blake said, because this is going to cost you something a lot more valuable, your time, your reputation, and maybe your life. Cassian swallowed the lump in his throat. Tell me what I need to do. Blake glanced over his shoulder, scanning the dark waters before leaning in. There's a shipment arriving at Dock 42 tomorrow night. If you want proof, that's where you'll find it. But it won't be easy. Drake's got eyes everywhere. Cassian nodded. I'll be there. Blake turned to leave, but stopped. One more thing, Dorne. Cassian raised an eyebrow. Trust no one, especially not the people closest to you. As Blake disappeared into the night, Cassian stood alone on the pier, the cold wind biting into his skin. He knew Blake was right. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford anymore. The path forward was clear, but it was also dangerous. If he wanted to take down Drake, he would have to be smarter, faster, and willing to sacrifice more than he ever had before. With the journal tucked safely under his coat, Cassian walked away from the pier, knowing that by this time tomorrow, everything could change. The following night, Cassian stood hidden in the shadows near Dock 42, the salty wind whipping through the air, carrying with it the distant hum of ships and the occasional crackle of a radio from the dock workers. He scanned the area, his pulse steady, but his mind alert. Blake had been right. Drake's men were everywhere, their presence a silent reminder that this was no ordinary shipment. It was something bigger, something worth protecting at all costs. Cassian adjusted the small earpiece Quinn had provided earlier, hearing his voice crackle through the static. You're in position? Yeah, Cassian whispered, his breath visible in the cold night air. I see them. At least 6 guards at the container. This isn't just another shipment. This is something Drake doesn't want getting out. Quinn's voice was calm, but laced with urgency. Stay low. You're not here to take them down, just to get the proof we need. Cassian crept closer, sticking to the shadows, his every step careful and deliberate. His heart pounded against his ribcage, but his focus was razor-sharp. He crouched behind a stack of crates, close enough to hear the muffled conversation between 2 of Drake's men. I heard the boss wants this out of the country by tomorrow, one of them muttered. Says we can't afford any loose ends. The other man chuckled darkly. After what happened at the bank, he's right to be paranoid. That Dorne kid is sniffing around. If he finds out what's inside this shipment, we're all screwed. Cassian's jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone and snapped a few quick photos of the container, zooming in on the serial number and the unmistakable insignia of one of Drake's shell companies. He moved closer, trying to get a better angle, but the sudden scrape of his shoe against the concrete echoed too loudly in the silence. One of the guards stiffened. What was that? Cassian froze. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping dangerously close to his position. He ducked low, pressing himself against the crate, barely daring to breathe. The guard moved closer, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Just as Cassian prepared to bolt, Quinn's voice came through his earpiece. Now, Cass, move now. Without hesitation, Cassian sprinted toward the far end of the dock, his footsteps barely audible against the wet pavement. A shout rang out behind him. Hey, stop! Cassian didn't look back. He weaved through the maze of containers, pushing his body harder than he had in years. He could hear the guards giving chase, their footsteps echoing through the narrow corridors between the towering crates. His heart hammered against his chest, but adrenaline fueled his every move. Up ahead, Quinn was waiting in an idling car, the engine humming softly. Cassian launched himself into the passenger seat just as Quinn hit the gas, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Bullets ricocheted off the back of the car, but they were already speeding away into the night. Cassian sat back, chest heaving, clutching his phone tightly. I got it, he said between breaths. The proof we need. It's all here. Quinn smirked as he sped through the darkened streets. Good. Now comes the hard part. Cassian nodded, already knowing what was next. They had the evidence, but exposing Victor Drake wouldn't be easy. The man had built his empire on fear and manipulation, and it wouldn't crumble without a fight. Back at the penthouse, Cassian spread the documents and photos across the table, his eyes scanning them with determination. Offshore accounts, illegal arms deals, bribery, everything his father had kept hidden for years. It was all here, and now it was in his hands. Seraphine arrived not long after, her eyes widening as she took in the evidence. "You did it," she whispered. "You found what he was hiding." Cassian nodded. "Now we take it to the press, to the authorities. We end this." Seraphine hesitated. "Cassian, once this goes public, there's no turning back. Are you ready for that?" He looked at her, the weight of the past and the burden of the future pressing down on him. "I have to be," he said, his voice steady. "I won't let my father's mistakes define me. I'm going to fix this." But just as he reached for his phone to make the call, it buzzed in his hand. A single message flashed across the screen. "I warned you, Dorne. Walk away while you still can." Cassian's stomach tightened. The threat was clear. Victor Drake wasn't going down without a fight. He glanced at Seraphine, then at the pile of evidence spread before him. No more running. Cassian inhaled deeply and pressed the call button. "We have a problem," he said into the phone, "and I'm ready to solve it." As the rain continued to fall outside, he knew one thing for certain. This was the beginning of the end. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready.